Welcome to Fresh Hope's podcast, Collective Conversations, where we welcome a diverse range of leaders to reflect on themes that matter to our movement.
So I want to say hello and welcome to those who are listening, but also to Daz Farrell, our Executive Ministry Director, and Stephen Cha, Senior Leader from the Chapel here in Sydney. And today I'm Anne Simpson.
Yeah.
And I'm hosting this first Collective Conversations, a series of conversations that we're going to be having around a range of topics that have energy and importance for us as a movement, and to give opportunity for our movement to have a voice and to have the conversations that we need to have in this season. So really grateful to Daz and Stephen for being part of this today. And today what we're going to start with is something you've been speaking about, Daz, in a few different locations. And as you move about our churches and our movement, and that's the idea of Metron, and this idea that Paul speaks of about a measure. And so our listeners will have access to that piece of writing you've done on that, and we'll explore that a little bit more for those who haven't written. But before I actually wanted to ask both of you, what actually energizes you about having a conversation about Metron today?
Yeah, well, I think for me, anytime I can get to speak with you, Stephen, and you, Anne, on anything, I'm excited by it. But actually, yesterday when we were doing just a little pre-chat I actually think, Steve, you brought some awesome stirring. So I think I'm kind of like, I can't wait to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, getting on the podcast and I guess exploring new medium to be able to speak to our family and the greater universe as well. We're not expecting millions of people to tune in the first episode, maybe the second episode. But yeah, to just, there's so much media and so much information and content out there. I think for us to be able to provide some voices within our family that hopefully represent Jesus, we'll also be able to benefit those listening in. So yeah, that's what excites me, not just about today, but the other ones to come as well.
Yeah. Sounds great. And, Stephen, you come from a church planting and a senior leadership, but also a multi-ethnic perspective. For those who are listening, you grew up in Australia, but you do have a background from Korea. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I apologise to everyone listening. The accent might throw you off, but I was actually, my parents are from South Korea, but I was born here. And the accent, my wife tells me, got worse over the last 7 years as I worked alongside a lot of tradies in Bunnings, which is the best store in the world. Bunnings, if you're listening, I'd love to get some sponsorship deals as well. Happen discount. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's a very unique subculture that I grew up in with living in Australia, growing up in Australia, but also having Asian heritage. And yeah, I think that brings about another layer of complexity in some of the conversations that we'll have. And and so if you're listening and you're from a subculture, or you maybe didn't grow up in Australia, hopefully some of the things that we talk about might resonate with you. And that would be cool. And feel free to give feedback on that as well.
Absolutely.
And it's great, Daz, having you sitting at this table, because as you take up this role as Executive Ministry Director, you're looking both at the macro picture, as well as you've been in the micro working with some of our tiniest communities in pioneering. So it's across the whole movement and at every level that this potentially has application. So that really that excites me, seeing something that can be talking about, that we can be talking about, that can pervade every part of what we're up to and wherever we find ourselves in this family or in this movement.
Yeah.
So do you want to just help us, and for those who are listening, just give us a bit of an outline of this idea of Metron?
Yeah, that's good. It's good to try and start somewhere, in the 30,000 feet realm. But even when Steve was just speaking, when you've got the lens, if that makes sense, you kind of see it, right? So I go, do we want to do a podcast and add to the many voices? Or is there wisdom in us doing that? Even that is a question because it's about influence.
That's right.
Or the kind, right? So I don't want to add to someone's, and I can easily say, I don't want to add to your burden, I can remain silent. And yet that might not actually be what we're called to do. We might be being asked to participate and offer something in that space, right? So this idea, I think, has application in a lot of things that you do. But I think in our movement, the key piece would be the priesthood of all believers. This is such a strong DNA piece for us, and I love it. Like I go, how do we maximize that? And I think it's because not just in this movement, but in my work since I met Jesus at 27, I have seen so much diversity in the church. And I think like all things, you almost start with the problem. You read a text from scripture, you hear Jesus say something, like this morning. Some guy sends me a message saying, I'm praying for you. Actually praying greater works for you. You know, Jesus said you'll do greater works than these. And he go, who could do a greater work than Jesus? Like even that's, but how do you sit with that text? So the text is Jesus saying, by your love for one another, the world will know that you're my disciple. What does that mean? When we say love, what do we mean? Is that an emotion? Is that how do you understand love? That's a big idea, right? Like if there's not something that's understandable around our love, but clearly Jesus saw something in our communal witness to this. So I sit with that and go, why is that not the case? Or why would the world not? That's actually, we don't have to look too far to know that's not what we're known for. So this idea of what if, the kingdom's upside down? And you read Paul and he says, well, we don't, what is it to honor the things that are not? And what is it to celebrate? It's these parts of the body. All those things coalesce. And I'm going, why does that not seem to be my experience or my case? And one of the words whenever I stumbled across it was this idea of Metron or measure. And I thought it was a gift because it came with, it felt kingdom. I felt like it would correct some of the thinking and practice that had been taking place in some of the things that I'd seen. And I personally believe that every person is uniquely made in the image of God. And I feel like if they don't get to feel the fullness of that, so now I bring in the talents, how do they not be, I think the temptation can be if you've got one talent to bury it, right? So how does that not be the case? How do we end up people going, how do I walk in the fullness of my given self, Anne, as you would say? So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say is that how are we to have a measure of ourselves in this space? Would that be a really simple way of something that's true, that I can hold, a comment like Jesus saying you'll do greater works and yet be myself in my ordinariness.
Totally. And I think the self-awareness piece is massive. And again, the self is not, I can't know myself outside of community. So then it has to be that there's this communal understanding of this thing that we're talking about, my own measure. I can't self-determine my own measure because it's given, but it's tested in community as well. So, I mean, we'll knuckle down into that. But I think they were I'm trying to think of all the things that I'd been wrestling with for a while. And you know how sometimes it's not the silver bullet, but you get something that lifts the lid a little bit. You go, there's a bit more light, I think, now to this idea of how we function as the priesthood of all believers, which again, for our movement, is a key piece.
Yeah. And when you talk about this idea, you talk about it as having boundaries or, this idea of measure. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, and that's again like just listening to people like Peter Scazzero and others who talk about the gift of limits and other things. But I think the idea was if something has a limit or a boundary and it's designed for purpose, it will bless what it is. And so in the writing, I just gave a silly analogy of you're laying on the table, an operating table about to have your appendix cut open, you see a sword and a scalpel, which one do you hope, the guy uses, right? Like, again, it's not, you wouldn't say one is more valuable than the other. And that's what we seem to keep doing is equating size and value. But what about purpose? What about intent? And what about design? So I think for me, that's massive in thinking about this. So therefore, the scalpel has a limit in its size, and it no longer functions when it's the size of a katana or some other blade. So the gift then is in the limits, and I don't think that's how we naturally think. I think we naturally go, how do I burst beyond, or how do I become the biggest I could be, or how do I? Because these are the narratives we're getting from the world. But what if the gift lay in having a measure from Christ, who said, I specifically designed you in time and place with a boundary for purpose, and you could walk in that instead of we'll probably get to it, but comparison and envy and other things.
What comes to mind or emerges for you, Stephen?
I think it's really interesting how we talk about Metron and the measure, and as you mentioned, the gift of limits, because I think if we go back to what the world tells us, it tells us that bigger is better, stronger is better, and you do whatever it takes to get to that place. And what's interesting is, even though we say it's what the world tells us, it actually does filter through our families and our cultures and schools and media and all these mediums that are telling us these messages. I go back to that idea of how important is it for us to understand how important is self-awareness within understanding your measure or your talent that you brought up. Like, how do you know you've only got one talent?
Yeah.
Or how do you know you've got 5? And then the idea of community coming into that as well. And I find the community element really interesting. Obviously, coming from an Asian background, communities is one of the key pieces, cultural pieces for us. And we think that all things in community are great, but I think, as with all things, it can be misused. And you can have a lot of trauma within community as well. And I know that even the idea of living to your fullest potential, this idea of, living out your dreams, like, who's defining what those dreams are for you? Is it God? Is it scripture? Or is it your mum? Is it society? And I don't think that's really difficult sometimes as young people to differentiate. And so, but the idea of the gift of limits would be unheard of in Asian culture, because a limitation is a weakness. And any if you're heading down that road, then you're not going to be able to be successful, or but as you said, the kingdom is upside down. It defines success, define failure. And I think that's where we separate from the world. So I think that's a really great insight into measurement and the limits of that as well.
Now, it raises for me this idea of how are our communities of faith becoming places where there is, where there's wisdom, where there's safety, where there, is the opportunity to be able to say, to people at different points in their life, I really affirm the things I see in you. And for that to be something trustworthy to be able to depend on. And rather than, and I guess for me, I've been wondering how that requires, I would call sages, people who are gifted in actually holding many things and being able to ask those timely questions of us as young people coming through and testing a few things and trying a few things and experimenting. And instead of those failures being a negative experience, they actually end up being places where we're shaped and formed and released into our more fullness. So really that excites me about being part of a community like that. It also would require, the exercise of forgiveness and of really good communication and
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
all
the hard stuff.
All the stuff we find in family that's hard
That's right.
at times. So, I think, and for me, that's what smells and tastes like what John says, where he says you'll be known by the way you love one another.
Yeah.
So not that we've got it all together, but rather that we'd walk with each other in humility and love, that we would be shaped and formed and exercising discernment and all of those sorts of things that would make us a community of wisdom and of release for people into their Metron.
Yeah.
So, I really resonate with that idea. So
that's awesome. And I think just springboarding a little bit off that, like Bonhoeffer, reading his ethics, talks about being a confessing community the power of being a confessing community. So I feel like, in all honesty, we've all hurt people and we've all been hurt. Like, we can all carry that. But if we're able to say, this commodity that Jesus gives it's for the world, but he gives it through the church of forgiveness, through his son. I feel like it's a bit underutilized, but it's quite a weapon. And we see that, like the I Forgive Day the other day, you know, with like just the scandal of how do you learn to forgive when someone's taken the life of one of your children? How do you but that is a power and a powerful witness. It's true of my story, and part of my whole come to even meet Jesus was through an act of forgiveness I saw my mum go through, which was just profound, right? So I feel like if we truly were confessing, you know, James says, you know, confess your sins to one another so that you might be healed. And it depends how you load those words, but in your personhood. But if it was just, I missed the mark there, I'm sorry I brushed you, I'm sorry I didn't, you know, but if there was more of that recognition, I feel like that's part of the love, surely.
Surely.
Not my politeness or my,
Yeah.
but actually I'm going to rub against. And I think that's part of what we want to talk about, because I feel like the gifts that are given that are different and in their different measurements, in my experience, they rub up against each other. They actually cause almost this natural, and the gift in that is to go, how do I learn patience?
Yes.
Because I don't learn patience by the idea of reading it. I don't learn it in my morning devotion, right. I learn it by people who offend me and make me really, like, that's really where, so the only way I'm cultivated in these things. So therefore, in a strange way, if you reframe it and say, actually, it's a gift that someone comes and their particular gifts rub against mine because they're forming me, they're shaping me. It's that iron sharpening iron.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a community that can enrich both its wider community, but also can travel together in a way that's going to bring honour to the kingdom and stand apart. You know, if there's nothing different about us as a community, we often talk about this, but what is it that makes that difference? And, you know, walking in step with Christ's own character and that humility is so hard, and yet it produces the richnesses that we long to have.
That's right.
And we trade them, I think, for these superficial metrics of success.
Yeah.
You know, and because they're so hard to attain in some ways, and they require vulnerability in ourself and in our leadership and in our own person. And so I suspect we go, that's really hard, but this is a bit easier.
Yeah.
But it's superficial, and we end up being only a shadow of what I think God's calling us into being as his bride or as his body. The other thing I was going to say, Daz, that this really raised for me was this idea that gifts, where are gifts being exercised? Where is this measure or this metron? And I guess I want to put something out there, which is I just am wondering, have we ended up narrowing what those gifts are for as our own form of or our own fixed way of thinking about the community of faith? So the gifts end up being narrowed into only being used within our own community. And yet I am curious about if we're living into the metron that God has gifted to us, isn't that going to spill out?
Yes.
Isn't that meant to be for the wider sort of community? So I'm kind of curious what you guys think around that.
I think I would agree with you, and I think if you've grown up in the church, they teach you about these gifts that God has given to you for the sake of, and they don't say kingdom, and they'll say church. Mm-hmm. And being a church planner and having grown up in the church, when someone new comes and you identify their giftings, the automatic temptation is to go, well, how can we use those gifts to further our church? And we forget that the church doesn't exist for the church in itself, but it exists for the world and for the expansion of God's kingdom. And so, you know, and I'll confess, there are times where I fall into that trap as well, and a very gifted person will turn up, and our automatic thinking is, oh, that would be great for our community. But it's about understanding that it's not about just our community, but it's about how our church community can bless the greater community. And I think there's a lot of things in Fresh Hope that really challenge that. My time, we've been with Fresh Hope as a church for just under 4 years now, and I think I've had many challenging conversations with Daz and with some of the other staff here that they're always trying to push us outside of our church walls, which was very uncomfortable at the beginning. But being Asian, I was very respectful to my elders and, listen to the wise things that they had to say. But then taking them back to our local church community, they were very challenged as well. And so understanding that your gifts and the measure of these gifts is not, the success is not how well you can execute them in the church, but it's how you can execute them in the world.
Spot on. Because that's for whom Christ died.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I've been, over the summer, I was reading Brian Sanders' The Underground Church. So just for those who are actually watching instead of listening, that's the book. I actually really enjoyed what he had to say, because he was talking about this 20% who do 80% of the work. And so, trying to keep the event or the program running or the community running, if we want to use a kinder term, requires quite a bit of energy. And one of the questions I had maybe 3 or 4 years ago was, if I only have a certain amount of energy as someone coming in to be part of this community, and I'm spending that energy here making Sunday happen, where do I find the energy and capacity for outside of this community?
Yeah, that's right.
And so his framework was, what happens if we empower the 20, not for within the church, but for without? And, I find that a really interesting thing to think about, and to imagine, what if we sent our best people beyond our walls?
Yeah.
And yesterday when we were talking, Stephen, you talked about this idea within your own community of the idea of bringing people who are incredibly skilled and their energy is used for within, but not necessarily for their professional world, where actually they could be powerfully the presence of Christ.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that I experienced growing up in a migrant church was these young professionals that have grown up in the church, and we get lawyers and doctors and accountants and successful business people, and they're highly recognised, because of their gifts outside of the church. But in the church, they're given roles like ushering and, manning the car park. And there's this limitation of, in a migrant church, not being able to break out of the barrier of being the child. And even sort of moving forward, it ends up being you're actually attending your parents' church. And it becomes about what your parents can build in that church and not what about you. And so we've seen, many numbers in the Korean church anyway. We've seen a lot of the young people leave Korean churches because they just can't get past the cultural limitation that they will always only ever be as good as someone's child. And that limits their giftings. And then so they'll go to other churches and they'll thrive, and they'll get to use their gifts in more sufficient ways. Now, I think even then, but the challenge is to go beyond that and go back to the workplace. And how do you then express those giftings outside? But it feels like it's sort of an upward battle, because I think the church, we're not framing it well. Whereas like that temptation of, look, it's all about keep it in the church, and if we can make the church big and healthy and attractive, then people will come.
Yeah.
And going back to the idea of Metron, like someone's taught us that Metron. Someone's taught us that measure, that's the success of a church.
Yeah.
The bigger it is, or the more programs, or the greater the finance, But it's not. If we go back to the very first concept of, the priesthood of all believers, it's, are you living out your giftings in your everyday?
Yeah.
And that should be the Metron. That should be the measurement.
Yeah.
And so, a little bit frustrating to have sort of witnessed some of that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're winning that battle either, which isn't, great. But I think that's just where we're at.
Yeah. And people get robbed, I think, in that as well. Like there is a thief who comes to steal, and but even with the parable of the talents, just struck again. Jesus says, "Enter the joy of your master as you're exercising." So there's something about, you could profoundly affect the fate of someone's eternity with a smile, as the one who managed a car park in a gathering if you wanted to, right? Like there's nothing that is awesome. And I think that's part of it, is going, how do you, because I think we always look at the form or the external of it. So you said, and things all have to look the same. Maybe we should explore that. But like, it's saying, what's the scriptures are constantly going, but God weighs the motives of the heart, or God looks at the interior. So it's my intent, not my form, that matters, And so I could be preaching from as much of a false motive as anything else, right? I could do, but how does that happen? Like my natural radiance or warmth as this welcomer comes in can make a huge difference, and it can.
Yeah.
So your smile and your very presence, because that's what we believe in, a ministry of presence, could phenomenally change someone.
Yeah.
But if they were bitter, and you can see it when it happens, right? Subtext always comes through. Even if you're angry and you're preaching because you really want to hurt your congregation, it's the same thing. So people get your subtext. Yeah. And I think that's important to consider, because as you think about how you express your affection for Jesus, whatever that looks like, people catch that. And I think where you're operating out of bitterness or envy or some other motive, I think that comes across. I think we forget that. I think we think, well, I've done the task. Every car is now parked. Except the scowl on your face. Man, everyone walked in here a little nervous or a little, so I think,
I think something that Sanders is trying to capture, though, is that 20%, is hosting for another 80% that aren't necessarily those who aren't won to the kingdom.
Yeah.
And that's the dilemma,
That's right.
So I don't think we despise any small offering, but it's where are we directing those resources and that energy? And if we are holding that metron or that measure to ourselves, for ourselves, and in our generation, the Sunday or the event is not necessarily where people are engaging with the gospel.
Yeah.
But we still have doctors and lawyers and accountants and teachers and nurses in places where people don't yet know this amazing message of Jesus. And so how are we encouraging them to live out their measure primarily there, and to come back to the community for encouragement and, for care and for support, so that they can keep doing that? Like that's, so I was really engaged by what Brian was saying. And I think for me, I'll own it for myself, but I think I felt that as a pastor in a church, you become aware that you're doing all this work and there's no one in the building that doesn't know Jesus yet. And so it's important and worthy to offer worship. But if we also think we're trying to share the gospel in that space where it's not actually quite true.
Yeah.
It's, so.
Well, that's why he has those irreducible minimums, doesn't he? Like worship, yes, but mission and community, like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. And certainly for traditions, say like I came out of the Salvation Army tradition before I was in Churches of Christ. That used to happen on a Wednesday in their tradition. Wednesday was a time when they would preach, and it was intentionally something for people to come, and they would rally people to hear this message, in the way of the 1800s when you would stand on a soapbox. But Sunday was recognised as a day of holiness and calling people to holiness. And it was for the believer. And I feel like that's a bit truer, like to be able to say this is what this space is for. And we can live out our metron, because there are gifts given for the church and for the body. And we are to care for the body of believers, not just for people outside. But there are also metron and gifts that are to be given and not to be withheld, I think. So, anyway, I think I've probably ranted enough in that space.
No, not at all. It's good. It's very good.
Yeah. It does kind of raise this whole idea of vocation, I think, though, that, I've been wondering too, as people do get energized and excited about this idea of, that they could live within this kind of gifting and measure that God has given them and be free in that and not try and be what they're not, that it also needs to widen our perspective on vocation. Because I think sometimes people get excited in this Christian journey and then want to go, well, again, so where is my avenue? Is it ministry? And vocation becomes associated with ministry, which is valid and true, but it's not the only frame. So how do we deconstruct, I think, is really what I'm asking. How do we deconstruct our communities in a way that allows room for a broader use of Metron?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because a lot of people, when we go back to self-awareness and the idea of identity, that vocation becomes your highest form of identity. I'm a doctor. I'm an accountant. That's who I am. I'm a teacher. That's who I am.
Yeah, wow.
And then when you come into the church, suddenly, well, you're not a doctor and you're not an accountant, but you're an usher. And sometimes I think we get this a bit mixed up, because even in that, the tension in ourselves could be, well, I'm a highly respected doctor out in the world, and I'm an usher here. But when we center our value and our worth on titles of vocation or roles, I think that's when things can get really mixed up, because suddenly what I'm doing as an usher is not as important as what I'm doing as a doctor, and therefore at church I'm not as important as I was outside the church. The idea of, we've been trying to encourage people, before your vocation you're a child of God. So whether it's outside the church or inside the church or whatever role you play, before the role is just who you are. And you were talking about the giver of self,
The given self?
the given self.
Yeah.
And I found that really interesting. You just want to just touch on what that was, and I guess the idea of the going back to that foundational element of what that is. But I thought that was a really fascinating concept. So if you want to expand so that our listeners can...
Yeah, sure. The given self, I did some work a number of years ago around the idea of how is it that we've ended up in this very individualistic Christian community where we can all take the communion on our own, and it's a very self-focused, just for me, and yet we're trying to do it collectively as a body of Christ. And I started to have this kind of conversation. And in the course of my work around this, I started to rediscover this idea, that long before I was here on the earth as Anne, I was already a self that was given to me by Father, Son and Spirit.
That's right.
And this idea that I existed in the mind of God long before I existed here on earth. And so there is a profound self that has been gifted to me, that it is not something that I have created, that has been given out of the freedom and love and creativity of God, with particularity. So I am particular and unique, and I am not you and you are not me, and I am not God and God is not me. And yet in Christ, he restores us to the fullness of being in union with Father, Son and Spirit.
That's right.
So God is in me and I am in God in a very real sense. And yet I never lose my particularity and I never lose my groundedness. It cannot be taken from me, this reality. It's been so helpful for me as I've worked through challenges in my life, as I've tried to hold in leadership, because we're called in the way of Christ. We're called in the way of suffering. We're called to lay down our life. What are we laying down? And if we don't already have a self that's been gifted and we understand it's been gifted to us, then we can't lay down freely what's been given. And Jesus talks about that, laying down his life, and I take it up again, he can take it up again. And so he himself, was a given self out of the Father, Son and spirit. So, it's in the incarnations. That's sort of an extraordinary area. And I don't claim to have worked it all out, but I found it really helpful to think, therefore, that there is a particularity about me that I come into this world. It's whole. And I don't have to live beyond. And, I was noticing, Daz, in some of the stuff you were writing, you were talking about the living under our Metron or living over. And what is it that, both of those things are, damage ourselves or others. And can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so what you said just sparked a million thoughts. So because I was thinking of the link of obviously, we're discovering rather than creating.
Yeah.
And and I think the world is increasingly saying, if I can use that word rightly, but the world views would be the world is given or I create. It's raw materials that I make stuff up out of. And so that's so critical when you're thinking about gifts, because if I create my own and make my own, or am I just discovering, uncovering, opening what was given, receiving what was given, such a different thing. And that relates to, in a way, the living under or living over, because I feel like there's a lot of ways that this can happen, but the importance of it is that if you live under, and that's the talents, if you are not, I think you lose joy. God's invited you into something, and it's brave, and it's risky, and it's painful, and it's all those things, but deeply joyful and delightful. But usually that's a form, for me, I'll personalize it, it's a formation issue. So I won't walk into certain things. So people have been telling me for years that I was a good communicator, but I didn't believe them. And I couldn't believe them because of my own false narratives about God and self. And so until that work's done, somehow the falseness of that, it's such a weird way pride works, sometimes overt, covert, but it's just going, actually, but if I was given that, I'll know that I was given that because the recipient will be blessed. I won't have to make it up. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to force it. Don't have to perform it and don't have to form it. I just have to offer something of that.
Yeah.
But the other challenge could be if I fear man as well in another way, the expectations could be so high on me. You need to perform, produce, and do all these things. And now I'm operating outside of the limitations of my gifting, and I will harm people because I don't have the gift. They aren't being blessed. They could be polite in saying something, but they're not. And so I think that's a huge risk, right? Because suddenly what you're now doing is saying, I'm only worthy. Now it's an identity thing. I'm only worthy when I do this. If I have 1,000 people at my church, I'm now worthy. But I still remember the first time having a growth group. This was a breakthrough moment for me in the Metron understanding years ago, when I had one person come from a growth group, and it was the most powerful time with this one person. We reclaimed some things, we cut off some stuff, and they entered into the freedom that they had robbed for years, that we would never have gotten in a group setting. And something in me fully clicked to say, this moment in time was exactly designed as it should be. But if I'd been going, I'm calling off group tonight because there's one person coming, so I would become utilitarian, or it's an economic decision. How wasteful. Look what would have been missed as an example. But that's about, again, that's the same thing about size or value of something. So I feel like to live under is either way, they're formation issues.
Which brings us back to community. Doesn't it bring us back to a safe,
that's right,
wise, that can hold us as we err on either side. We're either calling forth the gift or we're challenging the overcompensation of a gift. But again, it's community that both doesn't just rein you in or push you out, but actually holds you as you work through those formation issues, and being able, our own sense of self is so impacted by our own family story, by probably our church life, if we've grown up, and what we measure ourselves against, or what we live in or out of. And that needs, that takes a lifetime, I think. And we need good community to help us navigate.
Yes.
So,
correct. And I would say, if I had to generalize so what I've seen in churches for, the last 15, 18, 20 years, the primary thing I see is people living under in their Metron. They live under because they've got this narrative of, who am I? And that's why your given self is just so important. Well, I'll tell you who you are.
Yeah.
A unique image bearer who was held in the mind of God before the creation of the world, that you would have good, Ephesians 2, it works that you would walk in.
Yeah.
If you really believe that. But see how that false pride, oh no, but I'm not. Who am I? I'm not. I'm just a lowly. So that false version of that is what stops people living into the fullness, because they think it's humility, but it's not. It's fear. It's actually, I think, if you boil it all down, and I'll again personalize it, I think it's fear. It's fear of getting it wrong, fear of making a mistake, fear of humiliation and shame, fear of someone pointing at me and saying, you lose, or fear that I'll lose connection with a person or this community, and I'll be on the outcast. Lewis talks a lot about being in the inner ring and our desire for that. And if I risk this, I might lose my place. At least I get to hang out with these people. But if I stuff it up, I'm now exiled. So I think fear stops that, and that would be probably predominant more than people, I think, living over. And there's some of that, but I think predominantly in the priesthood of believers, there is that sense of under. I think some of our form has probably not helped with that. Yeah. By the way we structure our time.
I think so. I think the most frustrating thing is, and you'd see it in your own children. I've got 4 kids and 1 more coming, but I think the most, not disappointing, but what I would not want for my kids is to live the fullest life.
Yeah.
That not just, that Jesus has provided for them, but also as parents that we've done our bit to give them the freedom to be able to make choices in their life as our parents have done. And, if they were underperforming because they were in lack, that's one thing. But and I agree with Daz, I think fear is what holds so many people back. But I think that'd be really frustrating as a parent. And, I know Jesus doesn't get frustrated, but if he was one of us, then he probably would. But as a church pastor...
Are you so dull? I hear some frustration.
I've got, I've had the privilege of pastoring our church for 8 years, and some of these guys came from my previous church. So some of these guys we've been walking with for 16 years. And you go through seasons where there are times where people live under their Metron, and there are times where they do sometimes push over their Metron. But it is frustrating, and you feel bad for them, because you know that they could be so much more if only they believed it.
Yeah.
And I've had a few young men and women, and I keep telling them my job is to be your greatest cheerleader. It's just to cheer you on for you to become who God has created you to be, but they just don't know that part yet.
Yeah.
Because they're undervaluing themselves, and it's because of the voice inside themselves, that fear-driven, but also man-driven, especially parental expectations, worldly expectations, and that changes, I guess, their measurements, because now they're receiving their measurements against the world or against their parents' expectation and not from God. And that's why we see a lot of under.
Yep, spot on.
Yeah. It's funny, you see a lot of under, but you don't see as much over, I think.
No, not in our culture. I don't think in our culture. Maybe in others you might. I don't know. I haven't lived there, but I definitely noticed for us the importance of identifying against under would be key.
That's right, yeah.
I'm wondering, as we're thinking about this, Daz, you make a comment about how Metron might not just be something we apply to our lives, but actually it could actually be something of a corporate identity.
Yeah.
Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, well, it's hard, isn't it? Because it's not in Scripture. I'm always cautious to not over-extrapolate a concept. But I think the reason that's important is because if you think about a community of faith, or you think about, so therefore there's a corporateness to it, and Jesus walks among his church, like in Revelation, and his church looks probably different. He would see it differently, I think, to how we do, because he actually sees it as it is, what is the true, eternal church. But I still think that when we look at this group who would witness to the reality of the resurrection and the coming kingdom, if we are always going, what if this group was not meant to be 1,000? And we see this time and time again in remnant theology or whatever it is. God says, no, peel back, peel back, peel back, peel back. Why? Because it's actually about me. The glory is about me, not about you. So I will work in the impossible, small numbers, mustard seeds and other things to show you that it's my kingdom, I'm the authority. So I think, therefore, I'm curious to go, well, would, even with an organization in the world, like maybe you have a coaching business, or maybe you are maybe you have a doctor, but maybe you're a dentist, maybe you're whatever, but the size of it, we tend to go, the natural thing is to think, how big does this become? But what if I was designed for? So I think about that for the Fresh Hope Resource Centre as a body that supports churches. What size should it be? What's its measurement? And is it possible that it has one? And could it operate outside it too? And I think intuitively, when I've looked at businesses, they do that. I think Harley Davidson, and others try to experiment with various things, and in the end go, you know what, I think we just need to go back to making bikes. Because they've tried and gone, actually, that's not our measurement, that's not our thing. Yeah. It's not. So I do think that it's worth, as if you were thinking of yourself as a corporate group, could you celebrate that we were a community of 12 with great joy, instead of going, can't believe we're not 50 yet, can't believe we're not 100 yet, as though that was the outcome.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's Alan Hirsch who says, I can do more with 12 committed disciples than I can with 10,000 consumers.
I think Jesus proved that.
That's right. I think so.
5,000, but yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's right. Because it sort of says something about, could we allow ourselves to be shaped by the call that God has for us as a community? And I think this really strikes me as an idea that's central to the heart of Churches of Christ, because it says how Fresh Hope's goal is to say, how can we serve what the call is that God has placed on your heart and mind? And so we should be, the most diverse movement of any other movement in the body of Christ, because every single community should never use shoulds, but has the potential to look unique.
That's right.
Because we're fulfilling our own call. So I feel like there's something in that deeply resonates with who Churches of Christ is. Yeah. And I wonder what it would look like if we were if we as individual churches could be free of the measurement or comparison with another community and could just say, but what is it that Jesus has called us to? And is that this? And could we just live into that? And so there is a blessing to the community because we're not actually trying to be what we're not.
Yeah.
So, that really resonates with me.
I think the traditional Metron for success of a church is a really interesting question, because for many churches it is just about numbers, because that's measurement. How do you measure the success of a church? Or it's how many people you have, how big is your offering, and I think we forget that the growth in our church is not numerical, but is spiritual. And one of the things that we, in the earlier part of our journey as a church, was we struggled to measure spirituality. Because how can you measure someone's growth or maturity in faith? And which landed us on a little bit of a journey to do some study. And we found this study done in the States through Willow Creek. And they did this big survey of their church. And the assumption that they had was, if there are more people and if they're engaging in more church activities, that means that they are spiritually growing. Wow. But as they did this survey, they found that that was actually not true, that it actually didn't correlate to it wasn't the more you do, the better you grow. And that actually didn't correlate at all. Wow. And so they had to rethink all of their ministry philosophies. And for us, numbers are very key indicators in a church, and I don't think we can ignore numbers, because they do measure things. And I don't think for us to ignore numbers it would be silly. But I think you've got to ask yourself, well, what's the highest measurement that you're looking for? And for our community, we always use the word health, because health doesn't necessarily mean bigger or smaller. It's just health. Is it a healthy thing? Even in our physical bodies, like, everyone can look differently, but can all be healthy or can be unhealthy depending on the makeup of your body. And so I think that's a really interesting concept when you bring the corporate element as a church. How do we measure as a church whether we're healthy? And I think that's not easy to do, but I think is something that we should be striving to do. And also, as you said, I think Churches of Christ, or our Fresh Hope movement, we really do celebrate diversity very well. I remember the first experience that I had with Fresh Hope was I was invited to the collective that we have with all of our key leaders and pastors. And I remember the first night I parked the car down at the Tops Conference Centre, which is the best conference centre in Australia. Just plugging that. And I walked into the dining area, and there would have been about 250 delegates there. And I walked in, and there was not a single non-white person in that room. And I remember at that moment, and I immediately turned and I walked straight back to my car, and I called my wife and I said, this is not the movement for us, because I don't think we will belong here. And it was my wife that convinced me that, no, there's got to be more. There's got to be more in this. There's got to be a reason. And as time has gone on, really, I've really seen the embracing of diversity, not just in ethnicity and culture, but in form and shape of our faith communities. And it's really not got to do with size. And I love the fact that for Fresh Hope, we really do promote the priesthood of all believers, and corporately we really empower communities of faith to say, look, you define your measure from God. You define that Metron, because that's what God's given to you as a community, and we're going to support that. We're not going to tell you what that is, because what you've received from God, that's exactly what it is, and we're gonna champion that. And I'm so proud to be a part of a movement that is, really, I think is in line with the heart of God in our corporate community. So,
yeah, I think just bouncing out of that, Stephen, I think that what came to mind as you spoke that, which is a really powerful story, and I'm glad it's shifted. Like, I'm glad you've seen a shift, in these last few years, because I think we do need to reflect our country as well, and where we're not doing that in multiple ways, including socioeconomic, ethnicity as well, in a range of things. Where if we weren't doing that, there would be something going on that wouldn't actually be aligning with our own ethos. But it also says to me, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about the prophetic tradition. If you're going to set up a religion, you want to keep it self-contained and make it all neat and tidy, but God says, no, you actually need to always be called to reform. You need to always be assessing how well we're doing that task. And I think that if we could keep doing that, and one of the things, again, because I've been listening to Brian Sanders, is he says that every generation should have the opportunity to deconstruct and rebuild the community of God as it is relevant to and as God is directing the church. And I think that's a powerful gift. It's one way we can continue to operate in humility, saying that my generation might be leading, but the next generation are also the priesthood of believers, and they have a part to play in continuing the community.
Yeah, that's right. I'm really excited for our movement, actually, because of Daz. Daz is our new executive ministry director, and I think with Daz comes about the opportunity of building on so much that has already been built. And I think, as you said, as you mentioned, and the opportunity to reflect and to go back and go, well, not just as a church community, but as a movement. What are the metrons that we need to be looking at? And as the spiritual leader of our movement, I guess that's one of the big assignments that and I think that's probably why you're bullying on this, Daz, and to begin with, because like with any organisation, you've got to walk in and go, well, what are the important bits and pieces? But you want to tell us a little bit about, I guess, the beginning of the journey, and I guess, like, I know you've been speaking on this, but obviously God's had to have put that on your heart for us to be talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I might have alluded to it. Thank you for your wonderful vote of confidence. As you know,
here, by the way.
Yeah, as you know, I said to Jesus, obviously it's you and you going with me, or I'm not doing this at all, because I can't. But that is an example of me saying I've stepped into the measurement that I was given, right? And the reasons that I say that I wouldn't would be my own insecurities. So if I don't say yes to Jesus, and I don't see it all, and this is the problem, we don't see it all, and I'm heavily reliant on community to identify that, right? And I think one of the strange things that happened to me some years ago, I've probably got a couple of witnesses to this experience, it doesn't always happen, but when you pray for the Father's eyes and heart to see something, and you see it, and you see someone, and you kind of see them like he does, and that's very moving. I don't know if I've been more moved in my life, even though I love clouds and beauty in creation. I think whenever I've seen, so I get a bit, the emotion comes, think about when I see someone as God sees them, and I get a window into the Father's heart, I'm astounded. And I think that's the priesthood of all believers. I think the Father sees this beauty and glory and greatness in one of his image bearers. And I think our role, Ephesians 4, is to identify that. And I would say, how does someone end up having thanksgiving even for the way God has created them? I think these are spiritual tools. Thanksgiving is a beautiful, powerful thing. Thanksgiving for what God's given, but also thanksgiving for how God has wired others. And so what I noticed in the Fresh Hope community as I journeyed around was very different people, very different gifts. And when I saw them celebrate one another, that was very moving. So I remember one of our young leaders, I remember him just looking at someone going, I have no understanding of that gift, but man, I love that you do. The way he said it was just so powerful. And I was like, wow, there's something in this celebration of the other. So I feel like, imagine the world saw that. Now I think we're coming back to this idea of loving one another, where it was like, I'm sort of lost, that whole thing of, was it self, like, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's just thinking of yourself less, that whole idea. But that's being absorbed in the other almost, and going, how do I champion or call up is the idea I like, into the fullness of what that could be. And I think I have seen that. And I think that's why I have great hope and heart, particularly in this, because it's there. It's already there, latent within our movement. I think just trying to put all those pieces together and keep stirring and championing that is probably what excites me, because I believe, like, let's say we averaged, probably 4,000 to 5,000 people in our particular movement, but also I think we also influence outside as well, because we're a part of the body, and we bump up into other parts, hopefully how is each person? See, this is where I get bothered by the Pareto principle, the 80-20 kind of idea. I get a bit bothered by it, because I go, what does that have to do with the priesthood of all believers? Because it's an economic, and it's not that it's almost not why. He could argue that principle's almost wired into creation, it seems, like it does. But I'm still pushed to go, but there's 100% of every believer. And so how does the church now leaders reorient to go, how do I champion you? How do I get them? That's what excites me. That's what I see. And that's probably partly why I think I've been thinking about this as well. Because I've also experienced the opposite, like I've experienced when in the past, I would say, the envy of others, or and they don't want you to shine because sometimes you can feel threatened, and then your presence threatens me, and so I feel that warfare a bit. But then on the other way is also my own insecurities that stop me doing things. So I think I always feel like it's both. So how the the curious question, and use your language, would be how does a community create safe and brave spaces for the exploration without humiliation, shame, or locked into the roster forever? You know what I mean? Like how do you do that and say, how would I get to experiment freely in this community? And just imagine what that would be, again, as a witness to the world who usually is very utilitarian. You're here because you can do this. What about if you were here because we're exploring? But that would have to be a measurement. You would have to say of our church, we know we're doing well because we've got people trying crazy things.
Yeah.
We may never ask Daz to sing again, but, he had a go, But what a great thing, to safely explore. That's vulnerable. That's very vulnerable.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that's what this conversation, there's been various points in this conversation where I've gone, that's a vulnerable space.
Yeah.
That would be a vulnerable community. Yeah. But vulnerability is what brings connection.
That's right.
And if its trust has been built, then we can hold one another in that vulnerability and not hold them to it either, that they're stuck in that space, but there's room to grow and expand, and as well as room for our communities to grow and expand, that we aren't locked into one space and time, but that God continues to lead us, He's dynamic in the way that He's calling us into our community for each generation. So I think it's pretty exciting and scary. and I think we'll also take a fair bit of work, for us to create those communities. But I mean, in the end, I don't know about you guys, but I go, then it starts with us as leaders.
Yeah.
How do we start creating those ways?
Yep.
So, but anyway, I'm just wondering, going to draw this conversation to a close and just check if there's any kind of final words or thoughts that you didn't manage to squeeze in the conversation. I think there's plenty of things we could talk about, and we've got a whole
go all day.
Yeah, we've got a whole series we can.
That's right.
The not all the same word that you said yesterday, I think is important, because I feel like just clarifying that sometimes when a gift is, I just don't know, maybe we've said it, but maybe not clear, but just think about that, because I'm trying to think, how would practically someone take a hold of this to have it actually make a difference, right? This is not just a theoretical idea, but how would we ground this in reality?
Yeah.
And so I think the challenge would be, not all gifts are the same, of course, but also the same kinds of gifts all don't look the same in their expression or their extent. Paul does use the word measure around faith, gifts, and influence in different texts in Corinthians and Romans and Ephesians. So I just think that's important to go, well, not everyone does have the same measure of faith. Not everyone does have the same measure of influence. And I think that sometimes, I guess my invitation to any church or anyone listening would be, how do you display, when you come together, display the various sizes and shapes of the gifts? Because I think that I can't tell you how much I love, and I saw this on Sunday in a church I was a part of, watching a sister who's younger, who's growing, give a communion message. Oh man, my heart just and my wife was the same. She's like, can you believe that? Yes, because you're watching someone walk boldly in to this. And every time I see that, so I feel like, how do we not be worldly in showing and actually saying, you don't have to be Billy Graham, you don't have to be this, you don't have to be that. But I feel like whenever we just see that kind of gift on display, we say, well, I don't have that, so I won't do anything. And I think that contributes to the burying, because I'm going, well, I could never do that. But is God even asking you to?
Yeah.
So, but the alternative is, but what does it look like then? How does my creative imagination get stirred to what this could look like? Because I think we get prescriptive on form, whereas I think Tim Keller, listened to him years ago, says there's a range. So with a call, he says you should have the desire, you should have the opportunity, others should tell you that you should do it, and you've got the skills. So you combine all four, and he says that's a call, that's a vocation. But how that gets expressed doesn't have to be as narrow as we often think it does. And that's probably what we were talking about outside the world before. But I think that's important to go, I may have an evangelism gift, I may have a mercy gift, I may have a communication gift, I may have a systems gift, but it might not look like that.
Yep.
So that's my curious question. How does enough of it be visible so that the imagination sparked
Yep.
and not shut down. That's
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm.
And I think that goes back to this idea about our giftings are for the whole community, and where do we get to have a go? And how does this align with Jesus's talk of the 72? And he sends them off, and then they come back and they share their stories. What would it be for us to be sharing our stories where, I had a go and, it didn't turn out the way I expected, but, I was actually obedient to what Jesus asked me to do.
Yeah.
And that, I think if we could affirm obedience, if we could affirm the reality that not everything we offer will be received in a way that we want it to, or with the fruits that we expect. Paul says, I planted the seed, Apollos, or however it goes, Apollos watered the seed, whatever it is, and someone else reaps the harvest. So how do we be sent ones, being able to go out and having a go at how our measure might find expression in a different place. I feel like that's something I need to. I've been spending for the last few months time in my front yard at the invitation of Jesus. And I'm standing in my front yard because all of a sudden our neighbourhood started talking a lot to us. And I went, wow, what happens if these interesting neighbours or these neighbours suddenly come to Christ and we form a little church in this place? And that would be a challenge for me to go, Jesus, you've entrusted me with that. Am I willing to position myself for that risk and have a go? And I feel like that's vulnerable, scary, but actually I want to go there. I want to have a go at what Jesus is calling me to do. And you have to keep trusting that he'll equip us as we go. And I hope I never get too old to have a go for him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's good. I think for me, now we're trying to land the plane. But,
See how we go.
there's this phrase, we've got to learn. You've got to learn to be comfortable in your own skin. And for me, it does come back to that self-awareness. But I think real self-awareness can't happen without God awareness.
Yeah.
And then within community that affirms that or rejects that as well. And I think our measurements become wrong, or we undertake other people's metrons for us when we are not aware of what God wants for us. And I think as an individual that's the case, but I think corporately too as a church. I think as a church community, if we are not sensitive to what God has called our faith community to be, then we're going to always try to be something else, and we're going to try to match someone else's metron, and that's never going to work out too well, because God has created you as an individual and as a corporate body to be you, and learning to celebrate that. And I think from Fresh Hope perspective, I think the idea that we celebrate that, I think we're right on the money. And so I would say for those listening, especially younger people, and feel free to define younger people in whatever age range you want to, but if there was any piece of advice, it'd be sit under someone who's a bit older and who's a bit more mature and who's done life a little bit further down, and ask them to help you to discover God and discover yourself. And I think that's when the right metrons will come about.
Good word.
Well, that's great.
Well, I'm going to land it.
Great.
It's been great to have this conversation with you both, Stephen and Daz. And
Thank you, Anne.
thank you. And may there be many more conversations. And, there's going to be some resources that are connected with this, so that if people want to read a bit further or they want to explore a bit more. And, we continue to invite anyone in our movement to have a conversation and to, with each other and with staff and of Fresh Hope, to explore further if they've got questions that have arisen out of this conversation. So thank you, and see you next time.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.